Hi, I'm Kate from the Primary Science Teaching Trust. Welcome to this short video around science curriculum coverage for 2021 and onwards. Hopefully this will be particularly helpful for science subject leaders as well as curriculum leaders as a whole. Just a really quick overview of what we're going to be covering. It's just making sure that we're clear on the most recent guidance that came out in February 21. So just looking quickly at that before we think about where we are now, what might be the most important things to consider before we go on to look at the curriculum overview as a whole with a particular focus on year 6 and thinking about year 6 because they have got such little time at primary school left. We're then going to go on to the different starting points that children may have depending on how they have interacted with home learning and how they are coming back into school. And I think that's the key takeaway from this short video. We can't hope to cover everything in the way that we normally would. And so instead, it's using assessment for learning, it's using formative assessment to try and make sure that we are aware of where the children are and so that we can move them forward. And that could be very different within the class, depending on how they have interacted with home learning. But it might also be very important to consider if we're having different starting points within our topics themselves, to consider what perhaps hasn't been covered or perhaps not picked up very firmly during home learning. So the general guidance from the COVID-19 operational guidance is around teaching an ambitious and broad curriculum in all subjects. So that is still the key message, but there are some important points just to pick out. What I've tried to do is underline anything that's particularly important in yellow, and then just think about how that might relate to the science curriculum. So we're thinking about addressing the most significant gaps. Science is a core subject, so science is a significant subject. We're going to inform it by assessment of pupils' starting points and gaps. So we've mentioned starting points. What sort of assessment might we be carrying out? Well, if we jump a bit further down, make effective use of regular formative assessment. So it's encouraging us away from any temptation towards summative assessment. And it also talks about avoiding unnecessary tracking systems. But then I think probably the most important phrase within that paragraph is you may need to make substantial modifications. Now we know that things are going to be very different. We can't hope to cover everything in the way that we normally would, so those substantial modifications are going to need to be made. Now that direction is significantly different to the guidance that was provided to schools in June 2020 as schools were returning. And at that point, the implication was that curriculum would be back to complete normality by Easter 21. Clearly, that's not the case. This guidance recognises that. And I think it's important to realise that that is recognised, and those substantial modifications will look different in each school dependent on the need of the children and the circumstances. So the early years has a paragraph assigned to them, and there is focusing on the language, personal, social and emotional development, as well as physical development. And then in reception, again, language, reading and maths. There's no explicit talk around knowledge of the world. There's no explicit reference there that can be linked to science, apart from this last line: consider how all groups of children can be given equal opportunities for outdoor education. So of course, outdoor education is a superb way of the children exploring the world around them, and that language, that maths that can be involved within those activities outdoors can link to science. And it's a very strong link, I think, there. In terms of Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, it talks about prioritising, identifying gaps and re-establishing good progress in the essentials. And unfortunately, science isn't mentioned within those essentials. It's mentioned when it talks about the curriculum remaining broad. It's worth remembering that science is a core. And so as science leaders, we're trying wherever possible to make sure that science is still firmly part of the timetable. Okay, so that's the guidance. Where are we now? Well, the pupil, staff and well-being is, of course, a huge focus as schools return in March 2021. And it's really important that curriculum coverage doesn't feel crammed, it doesn't feel rushed, and so it doesn't impact on that in a negative way. And that's why it's very important that we take a long-term view. It's thinking about how much time at primary school does this class, this year group have? And what we are able to do is to think about using all of that time in order to make sure that we give them the best grounding that we can in the science curriculum. Obviously, the younger the children are, the more time they have and the longer that term view can be, which is why we will talk about Year 6 particularly as an issue. Those new starting points to topics, which I keep mentioning, those different home learning experiences will have been had, but also there will be different topics that have been covered, and it might be that you think carefully about where to pick up that learning, and it might not be picked up for several months. Indeed, if the children are younger, it might be over a year before you come to those different starting points within those topics. And that's what we'll get on to looking at in detail as to how we might do it. If the skills are running throughout those knowledge topics, then the role of the curriculum leader, the science leader, is easier, because in terms of mapping out the curriculum, it's thinking about where your knowledge topics go and supporting the teachers across school with that. If the teachers are clear that they're having a really thorough explore of skills within each knowledge topic, which I'm sure they do anyway, then it does make that curriculum tracking slightly easier for the science leader, who can then just focus on the knowledge topic tracking. But it's very much about identifying priorities. What's important for your children at this time? And that is a good lead into Year 6, because obviously what we've got to think about with Year 6 is we've got to think about a realistic approach. We're going to have those skills running throughout the knowledge topics. We've got one term remaining from Easter until the summer break in 2021. We want that to be a positive experience. We want the children to enjoy being in school again. And so it's thinking about what coverage there can be in the time that we have remaining with the children. And so I think a very important fact to consider for the Year 6 teams is that link with secondary schools. And obviously this is easier for some schools if they only feed into one secondary school than it can be for others if they've got lots of secondary schools that they feed into. However, if those links can be made, if those Year 6 teachers can talk about what's been covered and where the strengths lie, then the secondary science team are in a stronger position to meet the needs of the children. So I think that's an important thing to consider. And then thinking about what the possible priorities might be for that last term. One possible priority could be that animals, including humans, is considered. I know several schools where the animals, including humans, in Year 5 wasn't covered due to children's absences due to the pandemic. And that is the topic that talks very firmly around changes in the human body. And I think we'd be doing the children a disservice if we send them off to secondary school and we've not talked about those important changes. And so it could be that animals, including humans, with that year 5 starting point is something to consider if it's a topic that you know wasn't able to be covered, or perhaps many of the children missed. And then it's thinking about what else you might cover. And obviously it's going to depend on what you have already covered, how well your children engaged when you were delivering home learning. But if you haven't covered living things and their habitats, what you can see in a progression document I'm about to show you is actually living things in their habitats links to many other areas of the biology curriculum. And we know that the primary science curriculum is very biology heavy. This is a document that's taken from the knowledge matrices documents that are provided by the plan resources. If you've not come across the plan resources before, they are fantastic. So please do check them out. The link is at the bottom of the page, and so will be on the PDF that you can download after this session. These documents are superb for tracking progression in normal times, but right now they are a super tool for looking for links that can be made across the curriculum and looking to where teachers can visit or revisit knowledge. And what you can see in living things in their habitats in year 6, that you've got the black objectives, which are the living things and their habitats, but you've also got all those red objectives where you've got a link to another topic. And in year 6, the link to the other topic is evolution and inheritance, which is a year 6 topic, but links so well. So you've got a very broad coverage that you could put in place in year 6, and then you could also be drawing on learning that has gone before. But obviously it depends on what you've already covered, and it could be that actually we've covered biology very well during home learning. We are going to be looking much more to the physics side. We're going to be thinking about light and electricity. And I know lots of people are thinking about different ways of doing that to try and combine. So maybe DT topics that involve both, but obviously that's different for each individual school. So having talked briefly then about year 6, what we've got left are 5 year groups. And what you can see here on the curriculum overview is a document that's been produced by one particular school, and this particular school did a tracking activity when schools returned June, July in 2020, and they tried to track what had been missed. And what you can see there, the topics that are highlighted in green are the topics that they have dropped in to a half term, or they have linked to another topic area to make sure that that coverage was there. And you can see sometimes it's things like a half term completely given over to a year group before. So in year 2, you can see plants year 1 focus is there. And then other times, rather than it being a complete topic as a standalone, it's been linked to another topic area. And the first one in that's like that is year 3. So year 3, in their rocks topic, they are also going to be covering year 2 everyday materials. And rather than thinking, oh, we've got 2 topics crammed into one, that's when we start to try and think about different starting points. So assessment for learning activities at the very start of the topic to try and establish where are the children with those everyday materials objectives from year 2, where does our coverage need to be leading through everyday materials into the rocks knowledge, which is very strongly linked, because obviously that's about materials as well. So we've got an adapted curriculum overview here. your curriculum overview might look different. You might have it on more than one page, but essentially this curriculum overview is just what are the knowledge topics for each year group for each half term. You may also not have done the tracking activity last year. If you didn't do it last year, then it's absolutely fine. A lot of the principles that we share today, you would be able to apply in terms of those different starting points. Okay, so in terms of the 2021 lockdown, it's these 2 half terms where home learning was taking place. And so teachers will want to think about assessment for learning when those topics are revisited. Teachers will want to think about how much of that knowledge did children engage with, did impact on them. And so it's thinking about how and when, I think probably most importantly, when to track back over that knowledge and to revisit that. And what I'm not saying is that everything needs to be recovered. You may have had a very successful home learning scheme that worked very well, but it is about the acknowledgement that learning at home is very different to learning at school. And so that different starting point. And it's thinking about how we might do that. So what you can see here is an attempt to try and think about where would we do those formative assessment activities around the topics that were covered during the 2021 lockdown. So in year 1, you can see they had split animals, including humans, into humans and animals. So they were going to take a lot of time over that and explore them in lots of detail separately. So instead of exploring them separately, they're going to make sure that animals, including humans, that the human section, that assessment for learning is done right at the start of the animal, including humans, animals section, and they'll have a good idea of how much learning children have retained, whether there are any gaps, and they'll be able to plan it into that half term. In year 2, the plants, again, different starting points. It links very well to the year 2 plants. Year 3, already we can see that we've got rocks with everyday materials year 2. So we've already got some extra possible gaps to be covering there. So we're not going to be looking at putting anything else into that year 3 curriculum. With year 4, the plants year 3 focus that will have been looked at with home learning will be looked at in terms of assessment for learning and linked to living things and their habitats. And in year 5, forces will be revisited during the earth and space topic. So what you can see here is it's an attempt to think about a realistic approach to making sure that learning during the 2021 lockdown is revisited and some sort of assessment for learning around it is carried out. But we've also got all of Spring 1 and all of year 3 that we've not thought about where that might be tracked and where that might be covered. So year 3, the 2 topics during the 2021 lockdown were light and forces and magnets, obviously for this particular school. And these 2 topics are fairly simple to track in terms of the fact that those topics are revisited in later year groups. So light is covered again in year 6 and forces and magnets is covered again in year 5, albeit very different objectives. However, it's that different starting point. So the light objectives from year 3 will have assessment for learning activities carried out at the start of when light is approached in year 6. And the same for the forces and magnets topic when the children are in year 5. And then what's important as a science leader is to try to track when will this actually be covered? What year is that going to be? Because obviously this isn't impacting on my current curriculum overview. And so I could do all this work and then lose track later down the line and not think about it. So it's just trying to make sure that I'm clear on what is covered and when. So those were quite simple topics to track. When it comes to something like Year 3 rocks, had that been the topic that had been covered during home learning, were that the one we were thinking about doing assessment for learning strategies for? It might not be as simple. You might want to look at it in more detail and look at the national curriculum objective statements themselves and look for possible links in the curriculum. And again here, this is where I refer to the plan resources. And if we look at the rocks page within the knowledge matrices, what you can see is that rocks itself as a topic, so those black objectives, it appears as a standalone. However, there are links that can be made across the curriculum, and you can see there that they are towards things like everyday materials and evolution and inheritance. So thinking about where those possible links might be, well, the ones that refer to the rocks and the soils themselves can possibly be covered in Year 5 materials. And then the objective around fossils would link very nicely to Year 6 evolution. So sometimes it might not be picking up a topic and doing your assessment for learning at the start of another topic, having different starting points there. Sometimes it might be that they are included in other topic areas and actually split up. And then again, thinking about when they would be covered. If you were wanting some more detail on how to do that, because that's just been slightly rushed, there is another webinar on our PSTT resources page. The link is there, and it takes you into a little bit more detail about how to use the plan resources and where you might make some links. So just looking then at those 2 year groups, Year 3 and Year 4. We looked at Year 3 in detail. Year 4, we know that we've got our plants being linked into living things and their habitats. Where was electricity going to be covered? Well, electricity for Year 4 can be picked up in electricity when it comes to Year 6. So just a reminder, as I stated earlier, just making sure that somewhere as a science leader, you've got an overview. What's the year group and the topic that needs to be revisited at some point? What's the link and when will it be covered? And if you can actually specify the actual academic year, if you can track that, it will make it much easier for you. So then at the start of the year, you can get out your curriculum overview, start to plot it out and just refer to it rather than thinking, gosh, what was it that we decided? So just remembering that you can do that and then go back to it, and that will make the process a lot easier for you. Okay, so the different starting points, the key takeaway. We're thinking about where the children are now. The formative assessment, the assessment for learning that we've been mentioning throughout this session, could be used all the way through topics, and I'm sure to some extent you do that, but definitely we can be thinking about using these strategies at the beginning and at the end of topics to look at where the children are and where they have moved to. And what we've got here is a selection of strategies, some of which I'm sure you'll have seen before, some of which might be a refresh or they might be new. And this page is linked, so when you go to the PDF, you can look at the ones that you are most keen on finding out more about. But it's just looking at what strategies might you use at the start of a topic to glean the children's understanding, to work out where those gaps are. And as we go through them, you will think, oh, that would work particularly well for my current class, or that perhaps is something that that wouldn't work for my children. And starting with model making. And model making is a lovely tool for encouraging dialogue. And we know that children have had less opportunity for that dialogue around learning, having been at home with families, as opposed to when they're in school with lots of other children. And model making is a lovely way of the children being prompted to show what they understand, and then perhaps explain to a partner what they have created. So the foil example here, the children were asked to create a bird and a mammal and draw comparisons. And what the teacher was then able to do was to recognize, are the children clear on the key features of those living things? Where are the gaps? What work do we need to do to move things forward? And that can be done for so many different things across the curriculum. What we've also got here is Play-Doh, and the Play-Doh here has been used to create a life cycle. And what you can see at the bottom, the children were asked to create a life cycle of a frog. And you can see there's an element of progression there from children that perhaps aren't quite as clear to those that are, in that some children have put 3 parts to the life cycle of a frog and some have put 4. So that's quite a good tool as well to be able to move learning forward. It's worth mentioning here that CLEAP's guidance at the moment is that Play-Doh should just be used by one person, or it should be salt dough that's made and then thrown away each time because of the risk of infection. So it could be that actually the easiest thing to use right now is foil, because obviously that can be reopened, reshaped and used again and recycled. Odd one out is also super for dialogue. What we've got here is an odd one out activity from Explorify. Explorify is another resource. If you've not come across it, it's fantastic. Please do register, it's free. Excellent activities on there. Some of the activities are called odd one outs. There are 3 images and the children are prompted to talk to each other. Which do we think is the odd one out and why? And it's not about finding a right answer, it's about the children explaining what they think and why they think it. And as they develop, they will move from things like, oh, I think the odd one out are the trainers on the left because they're blue and the others are black, to thinking about what materials the sports shoes are made from, what the soles of the sports shoes are like. And some children might begin to recognize, well, the running shoes and the football boots have got soles that encourage and create more friction to give the sports players more grip, whereas the ice skating shoes have got blades on the bottom that try to avoid friction, try to create less friction to allow the ice skater to glide across the ice. And so there isn't one right answer at all, but if children are beginning to talk about that level of understanding, it really supports the teacher in knowing how and where to move the children forward within the topic. The next 2 strategies are around vocabulary. Vocabulary is something that I think a lot of teachers are finding children suffering with in remembering, because of so much time learning at home and it being a slightly harder thing to do over Zoom lessons or remote teaching, however it is that you've been running it. This example is taken from the Active Assessment book, which is fantastic, and it's called Card Sort. So it's nice and simple. The children are given a prompt here, all plants have, and they have to separate their words into agree, disagree, or it depends on. And of course, this could be something where children choose their own ways to sort the vocabulary, or it could just be agree, disagree. It's completely up to the teacher and how the teacher is running the activity, but it's something that could be revisited at the end of the topic to see progression, as could this way of using a concept map. So with the concept map, there are words from the topic, and the children are encouraged to think about how the words could be linked. Are there any other words that they could add? And what you can see here is that the word opaque has been linked to some of the other key vocab words with a description of how they link. And it could be then that the word transparent is selected and the same thing is done. This activity is quite time consuming, but as I mentioned with the last activity, it's something that could be revisited at the end of the topic, and it could be that a different colour is used and the children can get a feel for how much they have learned during the topic in terms of their key vocab. Positive, minus and interesting. This is taken from a PSTT resource called Bright Ideas. Again, the link is at the bottom. And here the children are given a scenario, a statement, and then they think about and reflect on with their partner, whether it's written or dialogue, the positives, the minuses, and the interesting associated ideas with the scenario. So here, the scenario given, people have their own plant-like green skin, so they can create their own food in sunlight. And you can see the responses that children have given. And I think when you look at the interesting response, the last one, would diabetes be a problem or not? I think the children are being able to show there a really high level of understanding, which is super to see. But I think once you've used a strategy like this a couple of times, thinking through your own scenario, specifying a particular area of learning where you want to see whether the children have understood something would come quite easy. Concept cartoons are a superb way of giving confidence to the children in expressing their opinions. So a cartoon where different characters in the image give their opinions as to what's happening, and there's a gap there for the child themselves to give their opinion. And what you can see is that there are some glaring misconceptions there are contrasting views, and so the idea is that the children then are more confident in expressing their own opinions. Quizzes are something you may have been using quite a lot in terms of home learning. Of course, this could be done on paper. It could also be done using online tools like Kahoot, but they are low stakes. The children really do enjoy them, I think, when we use them online, but it can be, the reading aspect of it can be a bit of a barrier to some children. And then what we've got here is a list of other ideas. So if you're looking for new ideas, if the ones that I've already taught through are ones that, yes, I'm looking for some new ones, there are some new ideas here, including 2 other types of activities that are available on the Explorify resource, a superb link to a PDF on pictures for talk. So pictures that have been produced by the PSTT with guidance around how to use them in the class to encourage the children to speak. And then other games, matching games, drawing pictures, sorting activities and classifying. I think if children do sometimes see these things like matching games as games, I think that there is nothing wrong with that. At this time, we want the children to find their joy for learning, really looking for enjoying being back in school together. And with all of these activities, the children can be having a superb time, and the teachers are able to think about where they are in order to move the learning forward. Okay, so lots of information there. If you would like some more support with tracking your curriculum, if it's something that's something you feel you would like some help with, then the PSTT regional mentor team are here. If you were to drop me an email and let me know where you are, then I can put you in touch with the regional mentor that is closest to you. Obviously, at the moment, any support would most likely be done remotely, but that is certainly something that we can offer if you feel you need that support. Thank you.